Very warm welcome to BBC News, broadcasting to our viewers in North America and around the globe. My name's Mike Embley. Our top stories. Taking sides in Iran, the US calls for a UN Security Council meeting, denying claims that it is involved in the anti-government protests. Tragedy in Peru. At least 48 people are killed as their bus plummets down a cliff near the capital, Lima. The long-term poverty, a special report on China's hopes of lifting millions from their remote villages to a better life.
The continued existence of serious, widespread poverty represents a threat to the very legitimacy of a communist party that came to power promising to help communities like these, not leave them behind.
Also, the plastic problem. The UK under pressure to find new ways to recycle. Now China is banning plastic waste from abroad. And meet the scientists turning to artificial intelligence. Would you trust a computer more than a doctor? Hello. Riot police are out in force in cities across Iran as anti-government protests go on. At least 22 people have died since the demonstrations began 7 days ago. Hundreds have been arrested. Iran's supreme leader has broken his silence for the first time since the protests began, accusing his country's enemies of stirring up the unrest. The protests are the boldest challenge to Iran's clerical leadership in almost a decade. The United States is seeking an emergency session of the UN Security Council. Here's our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen.
In Tehran, squads of motorbike police are cruising the streets to break up groups of demonstrators. The protests have changed since they started last Thursday. To begin with, they were about the economy. Most of the protesters are young men. More than 50% of Iranians are under 30, and perhaps 40% of them are unemployed. But pent-up political frustration is spilling out, and much of it has been directed at this man, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He's the powerful figurehead of the Islamic Republic, and attacks on his posters will be seen as attacks on the Islamic system. He's blaming Iran's foreign enemies.
Following recent events, the enemies have united and are using all their means, money, weapons, policies and security services to create problems for the Islamic Republic.
It's not just Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, who's blaming foreigners. Mohammed Khatami, the former president, who's a reformist, says Iranians have the right to protest. But he blamed Iran's enemies, led by the United States, for inciting people to destroy public buildings and to insult religious values. President Obama in 2009 was careful not to give the last big protests his backing. President Trump has tweeted his support. The people of Iran, he declared, are finally acting against the brutal and corrupt Iranian regime. The Americans are encouraging the protests, but they deny they're behind them.
We all know that's complete nonsense. The demonstrations are completely spontaneous. They are virtually in every city in Iran. This is the precise picture of a long oppressed people rising up against their dictators.
The last big protests in Iran were in 2009 after a disputed presidential election. Back then, they were defeated by the power of the state, even though they were led by top politicians and faced a badly divided Islamic leadership. The new street-level protests don't have national leaders and may run out of steam. This is not a new Iranian revolution, though it's clear that many Iranians are fed up with increasing poverty and years of repression. The fact that protests are happening at all is very significant for Iran, its allies and enemies in a chaotic part of the world. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
Let's get more on this now. We go to Washington, D.C. and to Reza Marashi, Research Director at the National Iranian American Council. Welcome. Thanks very much for your time. Where do you head?
It's hard to say at this point, 6, 7 days in, but I think the proper metric to look at over the next week or so is how the government responds with regards to addressing the fully legitimate political, economic, and social grievances of people in Iran that frankly have been long-standing. And if the government takes steps to properly address those grievances in a tangible and sustainable fashion, then protests will likely die down. If they don't, then it runs the risk of becoming something bigger.
And how do you expect them to react? And how does this play into the dynamic between reformers and conservatives in Iran?
Well, this is a great question. And one of the things that makes it so difficult to answer at this particular time is that a lot of the people that you see protesting on the streets right now are a very different demographic than people that protested in 2009 or 1999. By most accounts, the protests have been small, but they've happened in a pretty large number of Iranian cities. And as a result of that, it's been a lot of middle class to lower class Iranians that have been protesting precisely because of the economic grievances. But you can't separate economic grievances from political and social grievances because it's politicians who are using policies to implement what's caused the hardship. So at the end of the day, it's really quite striking. And unless the Iranian government takes tangible steps to address precisely the economic grievances that make day-to-day life so difficult for innocent Iranians, then, like I said, things have the possibility of getting worse before they get better.
The US president and his UN ambassador are suggesting this is a popular uprising against the government. It's hard to imagine, though, that young Iranians see the US president as their friend in this, given what he said about Iran more recently.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I think while Iranian diverse socioeconomic swath of Iranian society appreciates moral support from the international community, those same Iranians inside of Iran are clearly smart enough to realize that this is a president, Donald Trump, who's banned them from entering the United States. This is a president who is on the cusp of reintroducing new sanctions on Iran that were lifted under the nuclear deal from 2 years ago. And it's the height of irony that while Iranians are protesting for their economic dignity, the Trump administration is pushing to put more economic pressure on them instead of the government.
Reza Marashi, good to talk to you. Thank you very much. And for more on the situation in Iran, including more on what's caused this conflict, head to our website. That's bbc.com/news. You can also download the BBC News app. Let's quickly round up for you some more of the main news. President Trump has threatened to cut financial aid to the Palestinians. He said on Twitter the United States pays them hundreds of millions of dollars a year and gets no, as he put it, appreciation or respect. He claimed the Palestinians were no longer willing to talk peace. The US recently enraged Palestinians by recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Protests in Pakistan against comments by Mr. Trump. He accused Pakistan of lying and harboring terrorists while receiving billions of dollars from the US. The US has confirmed it will withhold aid to Pakistan. The head of the Roman Catholic Church in the Democratic Republic of Congo has criticized the government over the suppression of opposition protests on New Year's Eve. At least 7 people were killed by security forces in the capital, Kinshasa. They were demonstrating against President Kabila's refusal to step down from office. A bus has crashed in Peru, killing at least 48 people. It happened on a stretch of road known to be dangerous north of the capital, Lima. Witnesses say the driver lost control when the bus was hit by another vehicle. It then plummeted nearly 100 meters down a cliff. Sarah Corker reports.
The blue bus landed down on a rocky beach next to the Pacific Ocean. More than 50 people were on board when it crashed. Most of the pictures of the wreckage are too disturbing to show. Witnesses say the coach collided with another vehicle and then went over the edge of this cliff, plummeting more than 100 meters. It happened on the notorious Devil's Turn of the Pasamayo Road, 50 kilometers from the coach's final destination, Lima. The rocky site is difficult for rescuers to reach. Survivors were winched up by rope and some airlifted to local hospitals.
They told us the bus had fallen off the cliff here in Pasamayo. It was an accident. We thought that my niece had left around that time in the bus. She went with her boyfriend. The two of them were in the same seat.
The Pacific Ocean Road is often listed among the world's most dangerous roads, and despite the sheer drops, it's largely unprotected by safety fences. Police say the death toll is likely to rise. Sarah Corker, BBC News.
The Chinese government has set itself an extraordinary target to lift 43 million people out of extreme poverty in just 3 years. President Xi Jinping says he recognises the pressing political need to close the gap between China's urban rich and some of its desperately poor rural communities. But some of the obstacles facing remote communities will be challenging, as our Beijing correspondent John Sudworth reports.
It's best not to look down. Step by step and heavily laden, this is the only way to the village at the top. But the 2-hour, 800-metre climb is easier and safer than it used to be. The old homemade wooden ladder, still visible here and there, has been replaced with a spectacular series of steel ladders. Remote mountain communities, languishing so far behind China's big cities, now find themselves on the front line of a massive anti-poverty campaign. The improved access to this cliff-top village has won praise from none other than China's President Xi Jinping. But life here remains tough. While President Xi may be promising to lift 43 million people out of this kind of extreme poverty, not everyone's convinced.
We have no income. We are poor. We grow corn and potatoes, nothing else.
The government says that it wants to wipe out poverty in the next 3 years in China. Do you think it's possible?
I don't really think so.
China has a more radical solution, though. In the past 12 months alone, more than 3 million of China's poorest people have been relocated to new homes. A smiling President Xi looks down on the new schoolrooms. This family has now left its remote mountain village for good. You know, have the open fire, you no longer live close. Do you miss those things, those traditions?
We don't miss the old way of life or the unhygienic things like having a pigsty right at the door.
Meanwhile, the anti-poverty slogans are everywhere. Even the new ladder is a national news story. This is poverty as propaganda. It's an issue that's now dominating the domestic news agenda, and it's driven by the vision of just one man. President Xi Jinping knows that the continued existence of serious, widespread poverty represents a threat to the very legitimacy of a communist party that came to help communities like these, not leave them behind. Even if China can help all those living below the extreme poverty line, tens of millions more will be left languishing just above it. But while there are many challenges, no one can doubt the sheer scale of China's ambitions. John Sudworth, BBC News, Sichuan Province.
Much more to come for you on BBC News, including this. Will 2018 bring the world's first vaccine for malaria? And what about the growing resistance to antibiotics? We look ahead to the main health stories to come this year. Very good to have you with us on BBC News. The latest headlines. The United States is praising demonstrators in Iran, but ridiculing claims by Iran's supreme leader that the protests are being orchestrated by outside forces. There's tragedy in Peru. At least 40 died when their bus fell off a cliff near the capital, Lima. We were reporting on this earlier this week. China has introduced a ban on recycling many types of plastic waste from abroad to try to reduce pollution. So what will happen now to all the plastic that is thrown away? Almost half of what Britain recycles has been sent to China. Our science editor David Shukman reports.
Ever wondered what happens to our recycling? Well, great streams of it are sorted in giant centres like this one in southeast London. The tins are extracted and are sold to food and drink manufacturers. A vigorous shake separates bottles from paper and cardboard. They're also in demand. The machines then try to pick out the plastic. The bags make this much harder. But if all this can be sorted, it can be sold on. And the biggest market has been China until now. This is the tip of the iceberg of what we all send off for recycling. And what the Chinese have done is said that they're no longer going to accept anything that's difficult to handle. So, anything that's dirty, or this kind of thin plastic that's hard to recycle. In fact, a mix of different types of plastic has sent shockwaves through the recycling industry. Already huge bundles of recycling turned down by China are piling up in Hong Kong, and mountains of unwanted plastic waste may build up in Britain.
I think it's a game changer for the UK. I think for the last 2 decades at least, all our collection systems have been geared up to having the Chinese market. China take, virtually half of everything that we produce in terms of paper and plastics in the UK. So what'll happen? Well, there's now a rush to try to sell the stuff to India and other countries, but there's a limit to what they'll take. Another option is to burn the plastic here. Most incinerators generate electricity, so this wouldn't be a total waste. But the greenest solution is to turn plastic into the raw material to make new plastic objects, like milk containers. We may see more of this.
We've made incredible progress in terms of recycling in this country, but we're stalling now. And the Chinese ban to import bad quality may be a great incentive and the best chance ever for this country.
It takes a human eye to pick out what the machines miss. Householders are often confused. Most thin plastic film can't be used again. Different councils have their own rules, and few products are designed with recycling in mind. There is now pressure for all that to change, and China's ban may actually encourage that. David Shukman, BBC News.
More of the main news for you briefly. The Mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, has announced plans to install 1,500 steel street barriers to prevent vehicles being used as a weapon of terror. The bollards are part of a $50 million investment to improve the security of high-profile areas of New York. A Canadian man freed from captivity in Afghanistan in October has been arrested and charged with assault and unlawful confinement. Joshua Boyle, his wife and 3 children were held prisoner for 5 years by a group linked to the Taliban. It's alleged he committed the offences after the return to Canada. His lawyer client will contest the charges. 6 people, including 2 children, have been killed in an explosion in northern Italy. Police footage shows firefighters tackling a blaze in Brescia. A fireball erupted after a truck shunted a family car into the back of a tanker, which then exploded. The truck driver was killed. The tanker driver survived. With the new year well underway, we look ahead to 2018 and what will be the most pressing health stories to watch out for. Our health correspondent, Tulip Mazumdar, has more.
These are the top global health stories you're likely to hear lots more about in 2018. The world's first ever vaccine for malaria is due to be rolled out in Kenya, Malawi and Ghana in the summer. Malaria killed almost 500,000 people in 2016. The pilot scheme will involve around 750,000 children in those countries. The new vaccine does have limitations. It needs to be given 4 times over 2 years, and even then it only protects around 4 in 10 children. However, there are high hopes that the vaccine could save tens of thousands of lives. There are so many health emergencies coming out of the world's conflict zones as we enter 2018, and yet more urgent calls to ensure medical supplies can get to those conflicts. The cholera outbreak in Yemen quickly became the worst in modern history last year. There have been around 1 million suspected cases in just 8 months. More than 2,000 people have died of the waterborne disease. Yemen is also teetering on the brink of famine. There are warnings that thousands of children will die in the early months of 2018 unless blockades at ports and airports are fully lifted and the fighting stops to let desperately needed supplies through. And in Bangladesh, the Rohingya refugees continue fleeing into the country from neighbouring Myanmar because of the Sanitary conditions in Cox's Bazar, where hundreds of thousands of refugees have gathered. There are a potential outbreak of cholera here too. Vaccination campaigns for cholera have already been underway, but the World Health Organization says it will start rolling out other inoculations for children, including for measles, polio and TB, in the coming weeks and months. The ongoing crisis with antibiotics that no longer were on my list last year and will no doubt be on my list for some years to come, because antimicrobial resistance is one of the biggest global health threats of our time. The antibiotics we've been using for decades to treat common infections aren't working as well as they used to. It's been predicted that antibiotic resistance could lead to 10 million deaths by 2050. However, there are new drug trials planned for 2018 in Eastern Europe for multi-drug resistant TB, for example, and this issue will be at the top of the agenda at a meeting of global health leaders in Thailand later this month.
Tulip Mazumdar for us there. And British scientists have developed a system which can diagnose some diseases more accurately than doctors. It uses artificial intelligence to analyse scans, and in clinical trials it did outperform human specialists for lung cancer and coronary heart disease. It could save billions through early diagnosis. Here's our science correspondent, Palab Ghosh.
Scans are modern medical miracles, but they still need a doctor to make a diagnosis. Until now. Scientists have developed artificial intelligence, or AI systems, that do the job better than the best doctors. The government's healthcare czar says AI systems are set to revolutionise medicine.
20 years from now, healthcare will have AI embedded at a whole variety of different levels, and much of the healthcare system will be enabled by smart systems that help you identify people at risk, diagnose disease earlier, diagnose disease more precisely, and identify who will benefit from what interventions. It changes the whole way the paradigm operates.
This is Ultromics, world's first cyber cardiologist. Developed at the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford, it's an AI system that can analyse heart scans. Here, Ultromics has identified areas of heart disease, shown in red. It then gives a recommendation, positive, which means that it believes there's a risk of the patient having a heart attack. Doctors get 1 in 5 of their diagnoses wrong. The artificial intelligence system does much better. So how much could hospitals save using the new system? 12,000 heart scans alone are misdiagnosed each year. That costs the NHS £600 million. Because artificial intelligence is more accurate, it could save £300 million, and that's just the start. AI can be used to diagnose many other conditions.
The software tells us the risk of it being cancer is, so we can just click on it, and it tells us the risk is 14%.
This system looks for early signs of lung cancer. It can rule out harmless cases several months earlier than human doctors. It can save the NHS money and patients a lot of anxiety.
What we have developed is software that will help us decide whether the patient has a nodule that we need to follow up, or is likely to be cancer, or is one we don't need to follow up, and then we can discharge the patient.
Britain leads the world in AI, and the systems currently being developed will be available for free to NHS hospitals next summer. Palab Ghosh, BBC News, Oxford.
Firefighters in New York have battled for hours to control a blaze that swept through an apartment building in the Bronx, just days after the deadliest fire in the city in almost 30 years. 23 people, 9 of them children, were hurt in this latest fire, which broke out on the ground floor of a 4-storey building. Firefighters were held up by water from hoses freezing on the ground because conditions were so bitterly cold. Parts of the US are experiencing a record-breaking cold spell. Sights like these are becoming all too common. Fountains frozen midstream, entire cities seemingly in a state of deep freeze. And commuters bundled up against the cold on their way. Then there is, of course, the boiling water trick. The National Weather Service has posted some of the gazillions of videos you can see online of people throwing piping hot water into cold air only to have it turn into something like snow. That's it for now. Much more on all the news anytime on the BBC website. You can reach me and most of the team on Twitter. Thanks for watching.